Welcome to the debate. Today we're diving into the core doctrines found in LPR Academy Module 6. Specifically, we're focusing on privacy, consent, and governance.
Right, the mechanics of the living professional record, or, the LPR.
Exactly. For those of us building these records, we know the LPR is this workaround private source layer of professional evidence and claims. But the real question is, what happens when the reality of your work involves highly sensitive, confidential, or employer-owned evidence?
Yeah, and that is the exact tension this module wrestles with. It introduces a profoundly necessary framework for how we treat our professional history. The central question the text raises is governed by a very specific doctrine. Proof is not permission. Evidence is not exposure.
Right, which is such a critical distinction.
It really is. We all know that capturing the reality of our work is crucial. So when that work involves a proprietary trade secret or a confidential client or an internal HR investigation, how do you preserve your professional truth without exposing protected details?
Well, we're looking at two distinct tools designed to solve this exact problem. And I take the position that the safe summary is the optimal tool here. It successfully bridges that gap between privacy and utility.
I figured you'd say that.
I mean, it works. It translates the original dangerous artifact into a governed statement, right? One that preserves the professional meaning and the narrative value of the work, but without exposing the protected details.
And I take the opposing view. I argue that the metadata-only record is the superior and, frankly, the necessary default for highly sensitive information, because any summary inherently carries the risk of contextual re-identification.
Even a governed one?
Even a governed one. The metadata-only approach goes one critical step further. It strictly preserves the proof's existence without retaining the dangerous artifact or any narrative shadow of it whatsoever.
Okay, let me lay out why the safe summary is so powerful and why I think it's the right default. The text makes it clear that privacy is not about hiding the truth, right? It is about preserving it safely. A claim can be true and still be entirely unsafe to render publicly.
Agreed.
So how do we bridge that gap? By using a safe summary. Let's look at the specific example from the source material, clip 4. Imagine a worker was involved in a highly confidential healthcare client project. It involved internal workflow documentation and stakeholder coordination.
Highly sensitive stuff.
Exactly. Keeping the raw documents is dangerous. You've got patient data, proprietary software systems, client names. But if we just delete everything, the worker completely loses their hard-earned professional narrative.
Well,
Instead, a safe summary distills it down to this: supported documentation and coordination for a regulated implementation environment. This ensures the LPR remains a functional, usable document for the worker. As the material states, a safe summary is not weak, it is governed.
I come at it from a completely different way because while summaries sound wonderful in theory, they are fundamentally flawed for highly restricted material. Let's actually define the metadata-only approach as outlined in the text.
Okay, go ahead.
It preserves only general information about an evidence item, its existence, type, date, role, and claim relevance. So for example, internal report Q2 2024, employer owned. It intentionally stops there.
Right, just the bare bones.
Exactly. It acknowledges that some artifacts simply should not be retained, uploaded, or shown at all. The worker keeps the memory and the structural validation of the claim, but they eliminate the radioactive source material entirely.
Wait, I'm genuinely confused by that. If I strip out the company name, the client, the specific software, and my safe summary just says, manage the complex database migration for a regulated client, how on earth could that still be a risk? What am I missing?
You're missing the mechanics of the mosaic theory of privacy.
The mosaic theory?
Yes. This is where contextual re-identification happens, and it's something data brokers and automated systems exploit every single day. The mosaic theory explains that you don't need a name to identify someone or something. You just need a few disparate, seemingly innocuous data points that, when you combine them, narrow a massive population down to a single, highly specific entity.
I see why you think that, But let me give you a different perspective.
No, walk me through how you think you're safe first, because I want to show you how this actually happens with a safe summary.
Okay, fine.
Let's say your safe summary states you managed a complex database migration for a regulated client in Q2 of 2024. Now let's look at the broader context. Your LinkedIn profile shows you were a senior consultant at a specific boutique tech firm during that exact quarter.
Okay.
Public business news from Q2 2024 shows that your firm was contracted to handle a massive, controversial compliance overhaul for one specific regional hospital network.
Ah, I see.
Right. You haven't summarized away the risk at all. You've just forced the observer or an algorithm to do a tiny bit of math. This is why removing names or relying on a safe narrative is rarely enough. The timeline, the specific problem, the role, the location, these residual data points in a narrative summary mathematically triangulate right back to the confidential truth. You cross the boundary into exposure without ever stating a single restricted word.
So you're saying creating a safe summary is essentially like trying to unbake a cake. You can claim you're only keeping the flour and sugar, like the general skills, but those ingredients are already chemically bonded to the employer's proprietary recipe.
Exactly. And metadata only just keeps the grocery store receipt. It proves you were in the kitchen, but it doesn't hold the recipe.
I see the mechanical risk there, but you are assuming that a safe summary is just a watered-down version of the original document, like it's akin to redaction.
Well, isn't it?
No, the text explicitly distinguishes between redaction and a safe summary. Redaction just blacks out names, right? It removes sensitive information but leaves the structural context intact, which is why the text warns that redaction is not magic.
Fair enough.
A safe summary is entirely different. It requires active judgment. It extracts the absolute core meaning of the professional capability, the coordination, the documentation, and it intentionally decouples it from the timeline and the proprietary context.
But if you decouple it so thoroughly from the timeline, the context, and the specifics, what value does it actually hold as proof?
It holds the value of claim maturity. This is a crucial concept in the LPR.
Claim maturity.
Yeah, claim maturity is how a worker tracks the development of a skill over time. So a junior worker might claim, I organized a team meeting. But a highly mature claim is, I architected a cross-departmental alignment strategy that resolved a critical resource bottleneck.
Right.
You need narrative tissue to prove that progression. If we follow your logic to its absolute conclusion and reduce everything sensitive to metadata only, just, internal report, Q2, we completely strip the worker of their rightfully earned professional narrative. How does a worker write a resume or prepare an interview answer 2 years later if all they have is a metadata log stating an internal report existed? The summary preserves the capability without the confidentiality breach.
I hear you, but you're prioritizing the worker's future convenience over present security and ownership boundaries.
It's not convenience, it's functionality.
I'm sorry, but I just don't buy that. Let me tell you why. We have to look at the nature of the material itself. A significant portion of what a worker interacts with is employer-owned material. Internal tracking documents, performance discipline records, proprietary business strategy, trade secrets.
Sure.
The text is incredibly firm on this. The LPR is worker-owned, which means the worker owns the private source layer they create. It does not mean they own every artifact related to the work. By attempting to summarize an internal HR investigation or a classified security vulnerability, you are creating an unauthorized derivative file of an employer's asset.
I think that conflates the physical artifact with a human experience, though. The worker doesn't own the employer's HR system. True. The worker does not own the proprietary code, but the worker absolutely owns their lived experience of navigating a complex stakeholder conflict or engineering a solution.
But they don't own the data points of that solution.
A governance-safe summary doesn't replicate the proprietary data. It captures the worker's behavioral and tactical application of skill.
But the risk of holding that narrative in a centralized digital record is immense. If we encourage workers to write safe summaries for highly sensitive, employer-owned events, the LPR risks becoming exactly what the text says it must not become, a confession file or an unauthorized employer dossier.
That's a bit extreme.
Is it? If the worker is ever subject to legal discovery or if the system is compromised, those safe summaries still represent a narrative shadow of confidential operations. Metadata only respects the ownership boundary perfectly. It says, I was here, I did a job, I have categorized the nature of the claim, and it stops before it becomes a liability.
But holding that summary in the LPR doesn't mean broadcasting it. The text provides a mechanical feature to manage that exact liability, the privacy and exclusion log.
Right. The log.
Yeah, this isn't just a conceptual idea. It's a functional vault within the private source layer. The worker applies a strict privacy label to the summary itself. They label it "Do not use externally" or "Interview memory only."
I know how the vault works, but
Let me just finish. The summary exists securely behind a default privacy wall, purely to help the worker remember what they did so they can speak to it generally in a future interview. The doctrine explicitly states the full record is private by default.
But why build a vault if you don't need to hold the hazard in the first place? The metadata-only approach utilizes the privacy and exclusion log too, but it does so without holding any narrative text that could accidentally slip through the cracks.
What cracks?
We have to talk about how those cracks actually form in human cognition. You mentioned that a worker needs a summary for interview memory. I argue that the human brain doesn't need a written paragraph to recall a lived experience. It needs an anchor.
How so?
Think about the psychology of memory anchors. Our brains use associative retrieval. A metadata tag like Q2 internal report, confidential client crisis, is a retrieval cue.
Okay.
When a worker sees that tag 2 years later, it triggers the associative memory of the stress, the specific problem, and the behavioral actions they took. Some information can be remembered and discussed carefully in a live interview, but it should never be written down in a centralized file.
I see.
The metadata forces the worker to rely on their own governed memory during an interview, rather than leaning on a written summary that could be legally problematic to possess. It forces a cognitive pause. And in the realm of privacy and consent, forcing the worker to pause before they speak is a feature, not a bug.
I agree the pause is valuable, but holding a safe summary isn't just about triggering human memory anymore. The minute we write something down digitally today, the temptation is to use it to scale our work. Which brings us to the elephant in the room, AI.
Oh, here we go.
How does holding a safe summary rather than a metadata tag change our vulnerability when we want to use an LLM, like a large language model, ChatGPT, to help draft our public profiles or resumes? Because I argue the source material actually supports the safe summary as the ideal mechanism for interacting with AI safely.
I strongly disagree. Introducing AI makes the safe summary infinitely more dangerous.
Let me explain the mechanics of why it's actually safer. The LPR doctrine is unambiguous. Do not upload protected material into AI. You cannot take a confidential client report and feed it into an external LLM to have it generate resume bullets. That is a massive breach.
Right, obviously.
However, the text explicitly points out that AI can be used safely if you work from non-sensitive governed notes. Once a worker has used their human judgment to create a safe summary, that summary becomes a highly functional, secure input for an AI prompt.
Highly functional, maybe. Secure, no.
You instruct the AI, using only this generalized, non-confidential summary, draft 2 possible resume bullets. Do not invent metrics or client names.
The safe summary is the exact mechanism that isolates the AI from the proprietary data, allowing the worker to leverage modern tools without violating privacy.
You are putting way too much faith in flawless human execution. The mechanism you just described relies on the worker perfectly sanitizing the data before it ever touches the prompt. And that is exactly where the vulnerability lies: human error.
But that's why we have...
Think about the cognitive load on a worker at the end of a long week. They're capturing their evidence, they are trying to strip out the sensitive parts to write this safe summary. What if they miss a detail? What if they include a seemingly innocuous internal system name that is actually highly proprietary?
They shouldn't be doing that alone. If they rely on safe summaries as their default bridge to AI, they are one copy-paste error away from feeding residual sensitive context into a public model.
But that's exactly why the Academy trains advisors in privacy-aware professional record governance. The advisor is there to review the output claim by claim. The text emphasizes that AI use belongs inside governance. It's not a shortcut around privacy classification. You don't just blindly copy-paste, you govern the text first.
Even with an advisor, the safest system is the one that requires the least behavioral perfection. Let's look at the mechanics of AI ingestion. When you feed text into a public LLM, that data can be absorbed into its training weights, or at the very least, processed on external servers outside of the worker's control.
Which is why we sanitize it.
But metadata-only completely neutralizes this AI upload risk. Why? Because there is zero narrative text to accidentally leak into a prompt. If the record only contains structural data, internal report, Q2 2024, there is absolutely nothing for the AI to ingest, and therefore nothing for it to hallucinate, memorize, or expose.
Well,
The text lists highly sensitive evidence categories: patient information, student information, legal documents, classified military information. For those categories, attempting a safe summary is playing with fire. The metadata-only label includes a strict "do not upload" warning. It severs the link to AI entirely, which is the only truly secure posture for restricted material.
I think that approach severely limits the capability of a properly governed LPR. If we look at the prompt safe use fields and the toolkit examples mentioned in the material, the safe summary is designed precisely to remove that firewall while maintaining utility.
Utility at a huge cost.
If we mandate metadata only for everything sensitive, the worker's LPR becomes a graveyard of dates and document types. It loses its life. It loses its utility as a source of truth for the worker's actual capabilities. Remember the core premise of this module? The resume was never the real problem. The real problem is interpretation.
Right.
A metadata tag cannot be interpreted by an outside observer or a future hiring manager. It merely exists. A safe summary allows for interpretation while respecting the boundary.
A metadata tag doesn't need to be interpreted by an outside observer while it sits in the private source layer. It only needs to be interpreted by the worker. We have to accept that some details are so restricted because they belong to the employer or a patient or a legal proceeding that the decay of a specific granular memory over 10 years might just be the appropriate price of absolute professional integrity.
That's a heavy price.
We cannot optimize for the ease of writing the worker's future resume at the expense of a third party's present security. The advisor's job is not to expose the strongest proof. The advisor's job is to preserve enough governed proof to support the claim safely. And sometimes enough governed proof is simply the metadata, verifying the timeline and the existence of the work.
Well, that is a rigorous boundary, and it forces us to truly evaluate the weight of the artifacts we handle in our daily work. Whether a worker uses a safe summary to preserve the narrative of their claim maturity, or, relies on metadata only to completely sever the physical liability, both approaches demand a profound shift in how we view digital evidence.
I think we both agree fundamentally on the core doctrines of the Academy. The full LPR is private by default. Proof is not permission. And crucially, the LPR must never become an employer surveillance file, a credential arms race, or an AI training dump.
Right.
It is a worker-owned source layer, and protecting that layer requires constant, vigilant judgment.
It really reflects the deeply sophisticated nature of professional privacy. Building a trustworthy career record isn't about hoarding every document or oversharing every triumph just to prove your worth. It requires continuous, careful decision-making about what version of the truth belongs in which layer.
Very true.
Some truths are safe enough for a public profile. Some require the governed translation of a safe summary within the private source layer. And some truths are so inherently sensitive, they must be reduced to metadata only, leaving the artifact behind entirely.
The act of classifying this evidence, of pausing to understand the mechanics of re-identification, asking if a summary is truly safe from AI ingestion, or recognizing when metadata is required, is the very process that transforms a chaotic pile of files into a true, living, professional record.
It leaves us with a critical lens to apply to our own careers. We have to look at the digital artifacts of our professional lives and ask ourselves, are we thoughtfully translating our proof, or are we recklessly holding on to the hazard? Think about the evidence you are storing right now. Does it require a safe summary to extract its professional meaning? Or is it so sensitive that a metadata-only record is the only responsible choice? We leave that for you to decide.